Welcome to the App Story's 10th anniversary interview series, brought to you exclusively by OmniFocus 3 from the Omni Group. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. It's good to talk to you again for the second time this week.
I know we have a lot of these to do, and so I think we ought to just dive right in. Today we have two developers who have had apps on the App Store from the very start. We're speaking today with Marco Arment, who got his start on the App Store with Instapaper and currently has the podcast player Overcast on the store, and also David Smith, who has many, many apps to his name, and too many to really name, but most recently has had a string of popular health and fitness apps, including Sleep++, Workouts++, and Pedometer++. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
We wanted to talk to you, since you've both been on the store since the very early days, a little bit about what that was like. But before we even get to that, I'd like to turn the clock back just a tiny bit and ask you, what, Dave, were you working on before you started on the App Store?
So at the actual time, right before I started working on App Store stuff, I was a web developer doing Ruby on Rails web development, which was just with a particular gig I happened to have at the time. But more relevant experience I'd had before that is I used to do development for the Palm OS and Windows Mobile. So I had done some degree of sort of old Palm and Windows Mobile kind of mobile development before mobile was really a thing. So I'd done that, a little bit of that work ahead of time. And then that, those platforms had kind of fizzled away largely. And so I had transitioned back to just doing web development for a while. So I had some experience on mobile stuff, but at that time I was, a web developer and had been for several years by the time the iPhone came out.
Yeah. What was it like building on things like Palm? I mean, what was the environment like for that?
Palm itself was it was very like low level C apps that you'd write. And I mean, it was a teeny little, I'm imagining the screen now. I think it was 160 pixels wide or something like that.
I think that's right. And it was square.
Yeah, it was a teeny little screen. And that was a wild thing to try and build apps for. But, you could do them. And, I was working as a contractor at the time. And, I was making government contracting apps, for people who do inspections on railroads, who were using Palm Pilots for to look up referencing and find track defects and so on. But it was different but similar in the sense of, the first iPhone was a very teeny screen, very limited capacity and performance. So it was similar in some ways, but definitely a welcome step up from a monochrome 160 pixel screen to something 320 by 480 was gigantic canvas to finally start using.
Right. I guess in some respects, unlike a lot of developers, you probably didn't feel as constrained by the iPhone because it was a huge step up from something like a Palm screen.
Yeah, no, it was huge in that sense. I completely had to learn a whole new platform, which I'd never done any Apple development before I started on the iPhone, but from just a raw capability perspective, it was a massive step forward, and certainly something I think that early experience has definitely helped in the early days to set my expectations appropriately for what was going to be possible and the ways in which I'd have to develop things.
Right. How about you, Marco? What were you up to before the App Store?
I was a web developer also. I had no other native experience, really. I had dabbled a little bit in trying to write Windows apps back when I was in college, and then I had occasionally tried to write Mac apps, but was just not getting anywhere with Objective-C, in my experience with it and ability to use it. And I mostly just didn't have any good ideas that were achievable, so I didn't really end up diving in. And so I was, spending my day as a web developer. I was at Tumblr, so writing a bunch of PHP backend code, trying to scale this massive website, trying to just keep up with the mania of a fast-growing site where you're the only programmer for a long time. It was pretty rough, but on the side, when the iPhone came out, I was there, of course, and I was just doing this on the side for a long time. It wasn't until 2010 that I actually left Tumblr and took iOS development full time. And until then, I was working there as my day job. Not even on their iOS app. I was working on the PHP code in the back end.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had this little side gig called Instapaper that was this little web app that I had made that was only a web app at the time. And then I made it to save articles to my phone. That I had just gotten that month, it was the fall of 2006. And when the SDK came out in the spring of 2007, it was obvious, like, oh, this could be way better with a native app. Like, it's so much better that I could actually save things offline. Because back then, like, web development now, you can actually do things like offline data. Back then, you couldn't.
Right.
It was much more limited than in the like offline stuff of what you have now. So I jumped in as just a side project that I was doing like in occasional evenings and weekends of doing my App Store app. But it was my entire career at that time, and my entire day, every day, was Tumblr.
What in particular was it about the iPhone that kind of grabbed your interest? I mean, because you said that you had tried your hand at Mac development in the past, and obviously the iPhone and coding for the iPhone is based on Objective-C too. What was it about, I guess, the iPhone that gave you the motivation or the impetus to really push forward with the iPhone?
I think, a small part of it was that the iPhone was just a lot simpler, especially back then. Like in the very early SDK, not only was it like, UIKit, which is the iPhone framework, much less complicated than AppKit, especially at the time. It was just much more basic. But also the tooling was much simpler because in that very first version, we didn't have interface builder. We still don't have things like bindings. At the beginning, we didn't have core data. And so there's lots of stuff that, like, the more advanced and matured Mac platform at the time, that's kind of like the standard of what you had to start with. So when you're starting from zero knowledge, there's a huge barrier. Like, okay, here's these 17 different things that you have to learn. Also, they're all really obscure. And also, there's not that much help or documentation or web searches out there. And so it's really hard in 2007 to get into Mac development when you don't know anything. It's not honestly that much easier today because there's just so much more help and example code out there for iOS. But anyway. But that's a small part of it. The major part of it of why I hadn't really gotten anywhere with Mac apps before is that I just didn't have any good ideas for something that really motivated me. Like, the way I learn a language or a platform when I want to is I want to build something specific. And the desire to build something specific that is also within the scope of what I can build is what pushes me through the learning process. It's what motivates me, because learning a programming language can be very slow-going and tedious and frustrating. And if you have a motivation behind you that makes you want to build a particular thing, and you can kind of see that thing slowly come together, that helps push me through it. And so that's why I basically never had a good idea on Mac OS that could do that for me. But as soon as Instapaper was a thing on the web, and as soon as then I could build a native app for my phone, I realized, oh, this is a huge deal. I have to do this.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that with something like Instapaper, that as soon as you have this thing you put in your pocket where you could actually carry around your articles with you, that would be something that would really motivate you. How about you, Dave? What were you, what about the iPhone kind of caught your eye?
Well, the strange thing about that is, so I didn't own a first generation iPhone, and I had apps on the App Store for about 6 months or so before I owned an iPhone. So like the iPhone itself didn't grab me in a particular way. I mean, at the time it was very expensive, certainly too. And so it was something that I didn't really see the value in. But what I remember when I got into it was, it just seemed like a unique opportunity, which it turned out to actually be the case, where it was it's like there was so much interest and buzz, and it was such a desired device, and it has so high sort of in the media and the pop culture, and then Apple comes around and says, hey, we're going to let you make apps for it. And it's like it's starting from zero, basically. Like, it was a really unique opportunity to come into something right at the beginning, which is an opportunity that doesn't come along very often. And so, and not owning an iPhone, not knowing anything about Apple development, I just decided that this was something I was going to pursue and try. And at that point, I would have been very surprised to come find out that 10 years later I'm still doing that. But initially, the opportunity just seemed so so real and so substantial, and so I just got started, and I built my first couple of apps just using the simulator and submitting to the App Store, never having actually run them on physical hardware, until I finally had enough of initial kind of success, and this seemed interesting that eventually I actually did get around to buying an iPhone 3G.
So, Marco, I wanted to ask you, I think I remember that Instapaper used to be available in two versions. One of them was Instapaper Free and the other Instapaper Pro. Why the decision to make two versions on the App Store?
So I started out with the free version only because as I was building with the SDK launched in, I believe, April of 2008. And then the App Store launched in like the very last day of June or the first day of July, something like that. And the problem was, just by the time the App Store launched, I knew that it would be important to be there on day one. But I just wasn't done with the app yet. Like I hadn't, in that few months, built an app that I thought was worth people paying money for. So instead, I'm like, all right, I'll start out free, and I'll figure out money later. Because it was a free web app that made very little money. Like I think I had ads on it by that point on the web app, but it didn't make much. It was a very small app, really. This little side project. It didn't cost me anything to host, really. So I didn't need to make money immediately on it. And again, it was a side project. But I also thought, down the road, I'd like to make this something that we can pay for, that people can pay for. Maybe I can charge like $15 or $20 for it. I mean, just now looking back, that seemed ridiculous. But I thought I will have a paid app, but it's not ready yet. So I'll launch free first. And the main reason why it was a separate app later when I launched the paid version, I think a couple of months later, the main reason is because at the time, I don't think we knew how to do paid apps and free apps yet. We definitely didn't have in-app purchase yet. In-app purchase it didn't exist in that first year. I forget when it was added. I think it was 2 or 3 years later. And then also, even when it was first added, it wouldn't have solved this problem, because when it was first added, only paid apps were allowed to have in-app purchases. It was this weird little quirk of history that now seems ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. I totally forgot about that.
Oh, that's right. I totally forgot.
Yeah. Steve Jobs' famous thing that free apps remain free. Right? Great sentiment. It didn't play out that way ultimately, but so at the time, like, we were just, all of us, customers, developers, bloggers, even Apple, we had no idea how economics of apps would go and what kind of business models had to be built or accommodated, or what would succeed and fail. And so I think we were all kind of just stumbling through, kind of blind, hoping to eventually evolve some business solutions out of this. And so this was just my very first attempt, and it ended up down the road. I ended up killing the free app and just having the paid app. And now with Overcast, I have just the free app, and it has an app purchase. And so there's, I've done a lot of business models over the years, as you know. But but yeah, at the time it was mostly just like I didn't really know what I was doing, and the options available to me were pretty basic.
And Dave, you've taken a different approach. You've released a lot of apps on the App Store. Do you have an exact number of how many apps you have?
I think the last time I counted, I've launched something like 56 different app types over the years. There was a couple of them where it was like there was a couple of very similar apps that I don't count in that, but it's something like 56 unique app concepts, I suppose.
But especially in the past few years, I think you've sort of established yourself in this niche of fitness and health-related utilities and apps. You have Activity++, Workouts++, Sleep, and Pedometer. Are you still in the mindset that you want to work on multiple types of apps simultaneously? Or do you find yourself be more comfortable in this kind of market of health and fitness-related type of apps?
I think currently I'm very comfortable kind of having found a niche, having found an area that I can kind of settle into and just continue to refine and develop. And, most of the ideas or things that I have in my mind for, new apps that I might want to make or things are, fall into that same category that I think in the early days, like the days when I would, there was periods of time when I would launch a new app, every month or two. Like it was, and I think largely it was coming from this place of, there was so much opportunity, it seemed, that like the App Store was just empty. Like, there was just, for anything, like so many, sort of areas or parts of, the App Store that we might take for granted now just didn't exist because, someone had to have built it. And, in the first days of the App Store, when there was, the number of apps was a few thousand, and then it became, 10,000s, and then 100,000 was a big deal when it, rolled over to there. And then, eventually it becomes, a million apps. But for those early days, there was a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so my approach early on was to just try anything that I thought that I could do a reasonably good job of building. I sort of dove in and built it. And, I've launched more failures than anyone else in the App Store maybe. But as a result, it let me hit, eventually have a few hits and have a few things that let it build up for me. And, the biggest one I've ever had was Pedometer++, which, is an app that I didn't really expect necessarily to turn into, the main app that is, the core of my business at this point. But it was an app that I wrote in, very, very quickly. It was in a couple of days, I think, just in between the time that the iPhone 5S was announced and the iPhone 5S was released like a week later. And it turned out that was the one that finally sort of hit. And, I was able to then, rather than taking the more scattershot approach, I was like able to just focus in on that and keep developing it out, and then build apps in the same genre to take advantage of the fact that I have an audience of people who like an app that I've made in a particular area. But it's this, and I think in general there's an evolution in the App Store that at a certain point, in a weird way, I almost would say that the App Store is full at this point. That there are very few sort of untapped areas in the App Store. That things, a good app probably exists to solve just about every problem. New apps will come around and old apps might die, but there's a certain sense of, it's not this green field where everything is, anything you can imagine, there's a good chance you might even be the first person to do it. And so I think that's evolved the way that I approach it now. And honestly, it's just nicer to really just focus in on a couple of apps. It definitely gets a little bit crazy trying to, balance all the updates and things. I remember for a couple of the years, in the fall when it's the new, so whatever, like the iOS, 6 update, and I have and here I am submitting 30 updates to the App Store in one day. Like that was a bad idea, but it's nice to only have a handful now. But I think in many ways that reflects a evolution in the App Store as well as an evolution in my own business.
Yeah, Marco, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the resources that were available in those early days after the iPhone SDK first launched, because, it's funny when you think that, we're 10 years into the App Store now, and there's probably a whole generation of iOS developers who don't know about those early days, and the fact that there was a strict NDA, which meant that there were very few, if any, blog posts about how to develop for iOS. There were no conferences, there were no books, there were no tutorials. It was really pretty hard, especially if you weren't already plugged into the existing community of Mac developers who had, I think, to some degree, a little bit of an advantage only because they knew Objective-C and Cocoa. But what were those early days like?
It was pretty rough. I mean, not only, at least we did have the advantage, as I mentioned earlier, like the platform was just simpler back then because it was much newer and more limited. So there wasn't a whole lot to know, but what you had to know to build apps, it was really hard because, think about, for any developers listening, like think about trying to develop now without web searches, Stack Overflow, or tutorial blog posts. Like it's basically impossible to imagine that now, where, back then there was this NDA on the entire SDK all the time. And so the only place that you could actually like officially sanctioned talk about it in public was Apple's developer forums. And you think they're bad now, they were way worse back then. And so It was just very, very hard to really learn this and to get help when you run into a problem. And over time, fortunately, I forget when they loosened up the SDK or the NDA. First, it was the beta was NDA'd, but then the general release wasn't NDA'd anymore. And then eventually they even stopped enforcing it on the beta. And that's when places like Stack Overflow could finally actually allow discussion of iOS questions. And it was such a huge difference because, just imagine, again, trying to develop anything where your only resources are Apple's documentation and Apple's forums.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because at the same time that Apple was taking, at the time, Mac development, I think it cost several $100s to be a registered Mac developer before the iPhone SDK came along. And that was free. I mean, you had to pay and become a member in order to put something on the store, but you could, download Xcode and figure out iOS for free, which was a huge change. But at the same time, Apple put these incredible restrictions on people talking about it. I mean, how was that for you, Dave?
It was, the strange thing for me, having no Apple experience whatsoever, like developing, is, I learned to make iPhone apps by learning how to make Mac apps, insofar as like all of the books and documentation about how to use Objective-C and Foundation and all of the various, like the more core parts were all written for the Mac. Like I think the main book that people like me who were coming completely fresh to the Mac, like the book we would read was by Aaron Hillegas, which is the Mac OS development guide. And that was the book that I would read and like go through, and very quickly you just kind of like transition into this world where you're just kind of like making it up as you go along. And for a long time, my development on iOS was very, I mean, it was like from a technical perspective, it was likely kind of awful because you ended up with take a lot of the approach of you try something until it works. And then like once it works, you just like stop, don't touch it again and kind of like move on. And it's very much this experimental approach, which is not great. It's not nearly as thoughtful or nearly as constructive as at this point now, where there's an established best practices about how to do things and good ways to structure your code, good ways to, even just ways to build good quality apps. At that point, it was much more of this experimentation, sort of learning by experience of just trying things. And honestly, that's part of why I kept making apps, is because I kept learning something from the last one that I could then use to make the next one better, because there wasn't that same sense of like the rich sort of ecosystem and training and those other aspects around the development that we just take for granted now.
Do you remember some of the most notable limitations of the SDK from the first version? Like some feature that if you think about it today, you go like, that's crazy that it wasn't possible. And yet we were able to build iPhone apps.
Oh, sure. I mean, I remember, it's just funny when I think back to like a big deal for me. One of my early apps that was successful was there was an app that that plays audiobooks. It's still one of my apps that I maintain today. But there was a big deal when I think it was in iPhone OS 2.2, where suddenly they added a whole bunch, they added AV Audio Player, which is this, like, before that, all of audio playback on the iPhone had to be done using Core Audio, like really low level, the complicated stuff that Marco's doesn't know, still doesn't Overcast now. But for someone like me, that like I looked at Core Audio and I was like, nope, this is never going to happen. And I feel like there was this progression where like we didn't have core data, so all of the and if you wanted to do any data storage locally, you were doing like writing your files to disk manually or using SQLite directly. We didn't have things like notifications. Like that was a big deal when we finally got the ability to write notifications, or like, this sort of, the initial version was so limited and so straightforward, which in many ways was great for someone like me coming at it with no experience, because I was in many ways on an even playing field with everyone else, because I could relatively quickly understand everything. And then that was all of the world I needed to learn. Whereas now, I think of how hard it must be to be a brand new iPhone developer today. Like the number of SDKs and things that you would have to think about and manage and understand is just, mind-boggling. Even something like core location, which has been in there for, since the first version, but it used to just like the entire like location framework was probably like 4 methods. And it's exploded since then into being able to do all manner of different things. And you can do location in the background. And which is another actually thing that we didn't have to worry about back then. There was many years before we even had the ability to have our apps run in the background at all. So you didn't even have to worry about a lot of issues, because as soon as they hit the home button, your app was quit, and then it would relaunch the next time they opened it. So you didn't have to deal with things if you had problems with your app that were if you had some issue that only happened if the app was running for several hours. Hey, maybe it isn't actually that big of a deal because the app is constantly getting quit. And then suddenly we have background audio, or even just, the way we have it now where apps go into the background and stay in a memory state. But, back in those early days, it was none of that. Everything was just super straightforward.
Yeah, there were a whole lot of issues too around, not only, background stuff, and also there was no state restoration API, so you had to do all that manually. So like you had to be ready to quit within about a second of being closed, and then be able to restore your state as fast as possible upon being relaunched to give the user the illusion that you weren't closed in the meantime. But also, it was just so hard to stay within the iPhone's memory limits, because the first generation iPhone and the 3G both had the same amount of memory. Your app only had about 22 megabytes total at best to deal with.
Wow.
Now, if the person using the phone was like playing audio in the background or doing something else where like the system apps could do something in the background, you'd actually have a little bit less memory. And so there were these constant things in the SDK that could cause you to have to reduce your memory usage. All the like did receive memory warnings. Like now in today's iOS, all those did receive memory warnings functions are still there. But when I create a new controller and it gives me that as like a built-in stock template, I delete it. I don't respond to memory warnings at all. Like I have a couple of cache classes that respond to them, and that's it. Because the actual today you almost never actually get them in a way that you can do anything useful with. But back then, like you had to be constantly aware of that. And there were things like, in the SDK, there were things like the view unloading, and there's the view did unload and view did load methods. Today, they actually, years ago, they deprecated view did unload, and now they say it's just never called anymore. Views are never unloaded. But back then, they were all the time. Like if you push a navigation controller, then the root view would be unloaded, so the current view would have more memory to work with. And what that created was basically tons of bugs, like constantly. That's why Apple got rid of it, because they were looking at like crash logs and everything. They realized like it was like the number one reason apps would crash would be problems with their view unloading and their code not properly handling that. And so they just got rid of that entire unloading system and deprecated the method because it was so hard to do without bugs. So like but back then it was just constant like jumping through hoops to try to work around the hardware's limitations. Not that different from what we have today with watchOS and the Apple Watch, because you have the similar issue of like very low power hardware, very limited resources. And so, you have to be very careful with how much CPU and how much RAM you use. It was like that for all iOS apps back then.
And is there anything that you remember that like he really wanted to have in Instapaper, but you couldn't, even though it was going to be difficult because of the memory? But is there any feature that you really wanted to have as a 1.0, but you had to wait because it just wasn't possible?
I don't remember a lot of specifics on that. One issue I ran into constantly with Instapaper is that I wanted my app to look and work as closely to the system apps as possible in the UI. Like I wanted it to look like stock UI widgets. But back then, UIKit was also incredibly limited. And especially in things like appearance customizations, like all the apps back then, they would like try to color the nav bar to their company's color or whatever. And to do that in the early versions of the SDK, you basically had to like subview dive and like find the internal views and set their background colors or do weird hacks like that. Like there was no built-in appearance support, or there were like, you could choose like 2 themes maybe on the things that did have customization support. You couldn't just like supply your own colors or textures or things like that. Today it's much better. Once the UI appearance system developed, that all became way easier. But none of that was there in the first few versions of the SDK. So any kind of UI customization or appearance customization ended up being either impossible or really hacky. And I remember one of the things I wanted to create a back button in a navigation bar that was the same shape as the system back button, and I like couldn't do it. I couldn't figure it out. Like I had to in fact, one of my earliest posts on Stack Overflow was asking, does anybody know how to do this? Because I couldn't figure out how to create a back button that looked like everyone else's back buttons.
Thanks to OmniFocus 3 for sponsoring our App Store 10th Anniversary interview series. I want to talk to you a little bit more about OmniFocus 3 for iOS. OmniFocus has been on the App Store since the very earliest days, making it a great sponsor for this series. Recently, the Omni Group released OmniFocus 3, a major redesign with great new features. One of OmniFocus's greatest strengths is its flexibility. Version 3 dispenses with contexts and adopts tagging, a much more versatile and powerful system because you can apply multiple tags to an item, allowing you to filter tasks based on multiple criteria. Another feature that's a great small detail is that with OmniFocus 3, you can sort tasks manually within a tag. It's a great way to get your setup just the way you want. Another cool addition is that your Today view inside Forecast can not only include items due today, but it can also include items from a specific tag. Just go to the inspector, select the tag, and it'll show up alongside your due items. One great use for this is to show your someday tasks, the ones that are undated, so that you don't forget about them and you can knock them off when you have a little extra time. Another great new feature is batch editing of tasks. Select several tasks and open the inspector to change a wide variety of attributes all at once. There are loads of other great new features in OmniFocus 3, and I'm going to cover them in each episode throughout the week. So be sure to listen in to each episode of our App Store 10th Anniversary interview series to learn more. In the meantime, you can go to omnifocus.com to learn more on your own and give OmniFocus 3 a try, and there will be a link in the show notes. Thanks again to OmniFocus for supporting the show. Dave, I wanted to turn to you and ask you about your first day on the App Store. What was that like? I mean, what was your anticipation as to what you thought might happen, and how did it kind of go for you?
So, I mean, the interesting part of that story too is that the initial sort of process of becoming an app developer was not particularly straightforward, and I ended up actually missing the first day of the App Store. That my first app I think went live in September or October of that year, just because you had to apply to be an app developer, and I think the mechanisms that they had in place to create and set up accounts for that were nowhere near large enough to deal with the number of requests they had. And so, as you know, on day one that I could have requested to be a developer, I requested to be a developer, but it wasn't until that fall that my first app was approved. And so I'd spent this whole summer kind of working on things, getting going, and then the App Store launches, and you start hearing all these wonderful stories of the big one was Trism, I think it was the game, game that and then that initial rush in the App Store had made all this money and was super successful. And if I kind of felt like I was it's like sitting there on the outside, like looking in, like, oh, come on, just let me in, let me, it's like I want to make apps too. And so I think with that first day on the App Store, my first app went live, I think it was just this sense of relief that like I'd finally had something, and it was just so cool to. Anyway, like I said, I didn't actually have an iPhone at the time, so I went to a friend of mine who did have an iPhone and asked them to like load the App Store and search for my app and like find it, and like there's the app I made, there it is in the App Store. And hey, of course I'm forced him to buy it too, but it was just exciting to kind of get through that process. And then from there, it's like that. It just it was this iterative process of continuing to just try new ideas and keep going. But like that first day was honestly just a relief that like I'd finally been able to do it. And you had all manner of back and forth and, things with Apple to try and actually get my account set up. That by the time it finally actually happened, like it was just this huge relief to be able to actually start doing this thing. And, at that point I kind of felt like I was playing catch up because, I was like 4 or 5 months behind, anyone else who happened to have been there on day one.
The sales reporting was pretty bad in those early days too, wasn't it? I don't know if that was still true by the time you got on the store, but I recall that it took several days, at least from when the App Store launched, it took at least a few days before people had any idea if they had made any money.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what kind of state it was in, but I remember it was very basically that. Like, I don't think I even knew until I got paid the first time, like how much I was going to get paid.
Yeah,
because there were no services out there like App Figures to make it easier. Earlier on, there was an app called AppViz, which I think is still in operation. That was like a local Mac version of basically what App Figures does now, but that wasn't there on day one by any means. I know for me, like one of the crazy things about day one, and by the way, I wasn't actually there on day one either. I was there like on day 2 because they had set this date and they said, if you submit your apps by this date, it'll be there in the store on day 1. And Apple just got way more submissions than they planned for. And so even though I did hit that deadline, they were like, oh, sorry, we can't actually get to everyone after all. So they just didn't. But I was there like on day 2 or 3. And I remember, walking, like it was funny, like walking around on day 1, like buying all these apps for our phones and all these like really basic, like dumb little novelty apps. But it was cool because, oh my God, our phones could do more than Safari and web apps finally. Wow, this is, it was great back then. But anyway, for me, like I wasn't looking at the reports and numbers as much back then because, first of all, it was a free app for the first couple of months, but also the entire mental model of what mattered back then was not, I'm going to launch an app and that's going to be the thing. I was looking at it as I'm launching the app for my website. Like this is the app for the Instapaper website.
Right.
And eventually that came to flip itself on its head and I realized the app was like the thing. But that wasn't until probably a few months later. Initially, it was more like I was watching the app and I was watching the people who were already using the website find it and say, oh, wow, this is a great new way to use the website. Thanks. And I was watching the server side, watching like how many accounts I had on the website, how many user accounts I had. That was my only measurement of success for a while, was like, how many users do I have on the website? And that's all I saw. And it wasn't until that started like accelerating way past where it was before there was an app when I realized, oh, actually the app is what matters most. Like in the very first version of my app, I didn't even have a way to create an account. Like I just had a login screen because the idea that somebody would get to the app first before having used the website was something I had never even considered a possibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because I think that probably happened to a lot of people because we were in a transition period where all of a sudden it was mobile first, not web first.
Exactly. Yeah, like the idea of doing things mobile first was not a thing that was widespread until probably about 3 years into the App Store.
Yeah. So Marco, when was it that you realized that maybe Instapaper and this whole iOS thing would be something that you could maybe do as your full-time gig?
So, throughout the fall of '08 and 2009, it was doing well. It was doing well enough that I thought, if I had to leave my job, I could find a way to make this work. Like the money wasn't amazing yet, but it was getting there. It was getting good. And I thought, okay, I could see the promise here. This could be a thing in the future. And then what really happened for me was in early 2010 when the iPad launched. Because it was a reading-focused app, and the iPad was really popular right up front for reading, the iPad really more than doubled my income from the app. And that's when I realized, oh, wow, okay, this is no longer a thing where I can look at this and say, someday in the future this might be good enough. It was today. I could quit my job today and this would be fine.
How about you, Dave? I mean, I know that you were doing consulting at the time, and you were kind of, over time, you transitioned to really just doing your own products. But where along that timeline did you come to realize that maybe you could make your own iOS apps and make that your full-time job?
I mean, I think I had the approach that I took that I think is still one that I recommend today when people ask me about sort of going independent on the App Store, and a way to do it is that's I did consulting, and the funny thing is I was still doing web consulting. I wasn't doing iOS development at that point as on a consulting basis. Eventually I did, but initially I was still just doing web consulting. And inevitably in consulting, you always have periods of downtime between projects. That was just the natural flow of working with a client and between different clients. And so I just got into this habit where I would work on my own apps during those periods, and whatever income they would generate would kind of become this fictitious client that I would have that would pay me for more time. And so at a certain point, it started to become that rather than just doing it in between projects, I would take on a project with myself, paid for by the previous earnings of my initial apps. And I don't know the exact time when I crossed over the point where I stopped taking any other outside consulting at all, but that was probably not for 3 or 4 years at least, maybe even 5 and 6, when I completely stopped doing consulting. And I think for me, it worked well to just kind of take this gradual ramp up approach where I never felt like I was sort of going all in on the App Store and putting my sort of my family's livelihood just into that. I was able to do it in a much more gradual process. And I think it was years and years before it really had, it made enough money where that was something that I felt like I could do. And I think too, along those lines was the fact that in those early days, it felt like the App Store, I mean, in many ways it is, but it's it felt like sort of this bubble, like it was this thing that was going to be this big explosion, and there was money to be made there, and it was this bit of a gold rush, and then it was going to dry up and it was going to go away. And in my mind, for years, I would, once we got the good reporting tools, once it was better than it was in those early days, and every morning you can get it, you sort of go in and check your sales for the day before. For years, I would log in, and in the back of my mind, anytime I saw a slight dip in sales, in the back of my mind, it was always okay, this is the beginning of the end.
Yep, this is it.
And I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go back to consulting. And it took years of those dips going down and up and down and up to realize that no, this is actually, a sustainable thing that I can rely on, and that I don't need to have this fear that it's just all going to disappear one day.
All right. So this one is a complicated question, and I'm not sure if it can even be summarized, but I will try. And I want to ask you, Marco, first. You have experimented with different pricing models and different business models over the years. What lessons do you think you've learned after all these experiments?
I think the overall theme, is 2 parts. Number one, don't assume that what has worked for you in the past will continue to work for you in the present, in the future, and when new platforms or new storefronts open up. And number 2, which is kind of related to that, is to be receptive of trying new models, to not rule out anything, to not assume anything is either not going to work or it would be beneath you in some way. When I first started selling apps, 10 years ago, I thought, the idea of having an app be ad based seemed a little bit odd at the time. Although I did later make Instapaper free ad based, but the idea of having things be ad funded back then was it sounded like it would never be a thing that I would want to do. Similarly, when in-app purchase launched, I thought, well, this is a thing for games and stuff. This isn't for me. And then later on, when subscriptions launched, I thought, well, this is a thing for newspapers and magazines, not for me. And granted, Apple thought that too. But then what I've come to learn over all this experimentation and everything is that markets change. Every market is different. The market for Instapaper was different from the market for podcast apps, and that's different from the market for games, and so on. And so I basically learned to not take anything off the table, to not rule out anything as like I'm never going to do that, or I never want to do that, or I can't ever do that. Because what succeeds in the App Store is constantly changing and is different for every kind of app. So it's important to leave yourself all the options that are out there because you might need them.
What about you, Dave?
I mean, I think I've had a similar experience. I mean, I have tried, I think, every business model that you could possibly have done. I've done completely free apps with no money whatsoever. I've done free with in-app purchase, free with ads. I've done paid up front. I've done subscription. I've tried everything I can imagine to possibly have done, for a business model. And I think the biggest lesson that I've learned from that is the understanding that there is no one right business model. There's no like, oh, this is how you should do it. And if anything, trying to emulate a previous model that has worked in another context is usually pretty problematic. I mean, in early years of the App Store, there was so much of it was based around the way that the business models worked for sort of indie Mac apps, which are economics that are just never came to iOS. And I think for a lot of people for many years, there was a lot of consternation and problem that was based on thinking about that model that clearly was working on the Mac and trying to shoehorn it into iOS, or that time it was called iPhone OS. It just didn't jive. And I think the key thing that I found is to just have tremendous flexibility around what you do and just try lots of things. And if you find something that seems to work, sort of continue in that, like invest into it and, make it work. But in all of my apps, like most of them have tried several models of how to, of how to monetize them. And you never really know what's going to hit until you try a few things. And I think it's even there is having the flexibility to understand that anytime you change the business model for an application, it's always going to it will be typically received there's always going to be some amount of negative pushback against it. Like people just don't like change, period. And so one of the things I've had to learn is it's like, well, if the app is just not working the way it is, like either I'm going to stop working on it or I'm going to try something new. And not working on it at all is going to make people way, way sadder than trying something new. So it's like having that ability to just like try something. And I've definitely learned to not make commitments, to not talk about things like, oh, I would, like sort of like what Marco was just saying, like to never do things where say like, oh, this app would never do this. It's like, you never know. Like you just keep your options open, try not to make sort of future looking commitments because the App Store keeps changing. And some of the apps that I've had, have gone through several cycles, even just within one app title, not even across apps, where, they may have started paid and went free and then free with ads, free with in-app purchase. It's just having that diversity. And also I will say, I've learned that having a variety of different business model approaches and different economics for different apps in a portfolio was one of the things that, to the earlier question, gave me the confidence of going full time in this, because I felt much more confident if I'm, in regular investing, you want to have your income coming from a variety of different sources. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And similarly, it's really nice if you have money that comes from advertising and money comes from direct sales and money that comes from subscriptions. It creates a much better sense of stability. Even in a slightly up and down world, as one's going up and the other one might be going down, and it helps you to sort of ride out those ups and downs that are kind of inevitable in the App Store.
Something that we've noticed, I think, over the past couple of years, first with the Apple Watch and then with the iMessage app framework, And then with the Apple TV, is this idea of Apple moving in the direction of multiple app stores, like one app store for each platform. And it's not clear whether this strategy is really working. And I want to ask you, Marco, because I've seen people ask you to make Overcast for the Apple Watch and make Overcast for the Apple TV. Do you think this idea of a bunch of separate app stores is the right one for Apple to continue investing on?
I don't know. It doesn't, now in retrospect, most of these are at least a couple years old now, and it just does seem like in retrospect, most of these have not panned out. I think the Apple TV is pretty much a ghost town, unless you're talking about a video app, in which case, well, that's what the TV is for. Otherwise, there's. I loved your episode about trying to find Apple TV apps.
That was pretty hard work.
Right. It's that I think that was an example where it sounded like a good idea before they did it, and then they did it, and then I think the whole market and Apple kind of realized, when everyone's thinking, I wonder what developers will do with this. The answer was, we never figured it out. And the developers are just doing what you would have expected a TV app store to be, which is video apps. And even the game story has barely played out on it for lots of reasons. But so anyway, I think, and you can look also at the iMessage app store. And what it really is a sticker pack store. And that's fine. But Apple had much bigger ambitions for it when they launched it. And the APIs are very rich and able to do lots of different things, but just kind of nobody's seemingly doing them besides things like stickers. And you look at the watch is another great example where the watch is there's a lot of potential there, but most of it is currently impossible to realize with the current just restrictions on the store, the APIs, the hardware. It's just really hard to get that to be compelling in practice for most app types. And so I think what we're also seeing is that Apple has never been that good at multitasking. And by Apple creating a whole bunch of new software platforms, they're basically creating a problem that they are really not well equipped to solve, or historically have not been good at solving, which is maintaining lots of independent stuff and pushing it all forward and really expanding it. And typically the way Apple does things is it kind of feels like everything that isn't their top priority has a staff of either 0 or 1 person working on it. And that's how a lot of these stores feel. They just feel like abandoned or empty, both by Apple and by the users. So the problem is it's hard to, when you're launching something like a new hardware device family, it's hard to look at that and say, will the App Store work on this or not? It's hard to know that ahead of time. So I do think the strategy of opening all these app stores seemed fine at the time they did most of them. So I can't fault them for that, but I do certainly think looking at it now, it's a really hard situation to look at and say there's anything good coming out of a lot of these things. And from a developer's point of view, it puts us in a tough position. Apple already has the 3 major platforms, iPhone, iPad, and Mac. They're all a little bit different, or in the case of Mac, a lot different from each other. There's already a problem of developers have limited time, have limited budgets, and even big companies, they have limited amount of money that they're willing to spend on their development staff and development efforts. And so you already have problems with companies big and small not able to keep up with anything beyond their iPhone app. Their iPad app either doesn't exist or is bad or is unmaintained. They often don't have Mac apps or have replaced their Mac apps with web views or things like Electron that are basically web views. And so every new platform, every new app store that gets added adds a cost to developers of this thing is different than the other things. And so if you want to be here, you have to almost start over, really, or do a whole separate dedicated interface. And I think what we're seeing is that we can't afford that. Us as developers, we can't afford to do that for all these different things. So I think the better solution for Apple long term, and I hope we're going to see some motion in this direction, I think the better solution long term is for Apple to consolidate more of these platforms, reduce some of these app stores, and make it easier to write one code base that can run on many of these platforms. Because we as developers just don't have the time to manage more than that, and I think neither does Apple.
So let me ask you both. There's this question that I'm asking to a bunch of developers for this series. I want to know from you one thing that you think Apple still has not fixed on the App Store, and one other thing that actually surprised you because it's done well. And I want to start with you, Dave.
I think the biggest thing that I think that Apple needs, should fix, or that is problematic in the App Store right now is it makes me nervous that the biggest source of sort of revenue and income and all the top grossing apps are all based around this sort of consumable in-app purchase, buying gems in slightly addictive games. Like, that seems to be a trend, that when they open the floodgates towards in-app purchase, specifically consumable in-app purchase within free apps, that's sort of like where it went. And there is such a mainstay of the revenue and the volume in the App Store today. And I just find that worrying, like, at many levels, both in terms of I think it can, it is the type of thing that can create, very unhealthy habits in its users, and weird and complicated expectations for the customers. And I think it just seems like something that's very un-Apple-like. And it always strikes me as kind of, it's a strange thing that Apple just kind of lets this continue to run in the way that so much of what they do around on the App Store is around, or at least from a curation perspective, and where they aspirationally sort of hope to drive it, is around making apps that are enriching and improve someone's life in a way that it's hard to make that case as much for an app that is so geared around squeezing money out of you with psychological tricks. And that's something that it never sits, it doesn't sit well with me. And I wish that they would do things to mitigate that and to move some of that away. And hopefully at some point, that's something that they might do. Something that they did well that I wasn't really sure that would happen was the editorial emphasis that they added in iOS 11 has been, I think, really well done. And it's, the editorial side of the App Store has something that has gone through many, incarnations and shapes and forms over the years. And when they announced that they were going to be going from a model where, most of the editorial changes were happening once a week, sometimes less than that, depending on which App Store it was, to going to something where it was every single day they were going to be putting out content and, doing editorial work, I was kind of skeptical that would actually work, that there would be enough will and staffing and everything around that. But they've come through on that, and it's a really interesting and compelling place in the App Store now, that it's something that I find myself going to on a regular basis. And it's really cool to see that, they made this commitment to raising the editorial bar within the App Store, and they've been able to follow through on it.
What about you, Marco?
I think the one thing that I really wish would get fixed, and this is a hard thing to just say fixed, is search. App Store search is still terrible. It's still really rudimentary. It still feels like the relevancy ranking that you get when you search for a keyword feels like search engines in the mid 90s. Like it just feels like it's doing the most rudimentary ranking and matching algorithms. Like before the age of Google with web search, like where things started getting much smarter and better at judging relevancy. It seems like the App Store search rankings are just nowhere near what we expect from not even modern search engines, but 20-year-old search engines outperform it, I think. So that and I don't say this lightly, but that I really do think that search is miserably bad, and specifically in the relevancy ranking once you get the results, which is really the challenge of search, not just keyword matching. And this also affects things that I think maybe they would care more about. Like, for instance, it affects search ads, because search ads are based on relevancy judgments for what ads showed for which keywords and which searches, and it's using seemingly the same bad relevancy algorithm that the main search does. And so search ads could be way more effective and way more targeted, and therefore way more profitable for everyone involved if that relevancy engine was better. And ultimately, just as a user perspective, just when you search for something and you see your screens filled with like various keyword spamming apps that are advertising like cropping photos on Instagram, like that kind of stuff, it's really hard to find what you want by search. And improving that or fixing that would benefit everybody, including Apple, including developers, including customers, everybody, except for, I guess, those Instagram cropping apps. Maybe it wouldn't benefit them. But And then one thing that's been surprisingly done well, I think, is the new App Store pages, the app pages in the iOS 11 redesign. I agree with Dave. The editorial stuff is great. For me, the App Store, the app page, I was really afraid of redesigning that because, anything Apple does that really changes the storefront or the way your apps look in the store can have a huge effect, positive or negative, on the sales of your app or the downloads of your app, because you don't know like how people are going to respond to, oh, this is now moved over here, this is now bigger or smaller or gone. It's a hard thing to predict, and it makes things very volatile. But I think the new App Store pages are really great at surfacing things that people care about and minimizing things they do. And one really effective example of this is that 1-star reviews hardly matter at all anymore. And I hope they keep this in the iOS 12 design, because basically before, user reviews were really easy to see and scroll through, and lots of them were visible at once. In the new one, they have emphasized the average star rating, which is good, because I think that is a useful signal. But the individual written reviews are now pushed down to the bottom of the app page, and you have to do quite a bit of work to see more than the first one. So that first one maybe matters a little bit, but none of the other ones really matter at all because you can't see them without some work. So I think almost no one's looking. So what I think this results in your star average still mattering, as it should, but that any one bad or unfair or abusive review you get doesn't really matter anymore. And that's really great. That solves a lot of problems. I mean, the whole 5-star review and written review system has lots of dysfunctions still left in it to solve, but this greatly minimizes the impact it has on your app.
So to close out our conversation today, guys, I want to start with Dave and ask whether there's still room for solo developers on the App Store. And both of you have mentioned that, in the early days, the SDKs were really limited. You could actually kind of know everything about the iPhone SDK in those early years. Today, that's probably more than any one individual can handle. So is there room for just a person working by themselves like you guys have done on apps?
I sure hope so. Otherwise I'm going to need to get a new job. I think the nature of being a solo developer on the App Store is, at this point, is a question of managing your uniqueness and taking advantage of the fact that you are a small or one-person team, that you can move quickly, that you can explore things and try things with more creativity and more flexibility than a larger company might be able to or might want to. I think those are the things that I have found are like trying to compete against a large company doing large company kind of things is very unlikely to be successful. Trying more focused things, more niche things, just having that kind of approach, I found has been generally good. And I think there is room for solo developers in the App Store, insofar as there is still, like, even 10 years in, the App Store still has a very large degree of demand and interest, and every now and then you get a sense of just how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people are opening the App Store app every day. And it's, I remember it was an easy thing that a lot of people would throw around. It's like, oh, what if I can get just like 1% of people who use the App Store to download my app? I'll be rich. And it's always a bit of a flawed way to think about it. But the reality is there is still a tremendous amount of demand there. And finding something that solves the actual problem, that is useful in a tangible way, I think the App Store is still set up as a place that will reward that and will let it go. And I think you certainly are right that you can't do everything. You have to, at a certain point, have a more narrow focused, I think, just because otherwise the complexity gets too great. And I think, and just something else that I found is when you start to involve like web services and having syncing infrastructures and all those types of things are places where it gets really hard. But if you can make something that's standalone, that solves a problem and hopefully solves a problem well, I think that hopefully there will always be a home for those types of apps in the App Store.
What do you think, Marco?
You can look at any point in the App Store past the first 6 months, and you'll see people saying, well, it's done, it's full, there's no room for anyone else, no one else can succeed here. And you look at all the apps that are successful today, all the apps, look at what Mac Storage reviews when new apps come out, and how many of those apps have been around for more than a couple of years. Like, it's probably not a whole lot of them. The market, yes, it is crowded. Yes, it is in many ways mature, and therefore, you do have to, as Dave said, you do have to be a little more specialized in a lot of things that you do, and certain markets and certain types of apps are going to be harder to compete in, harder to find a market in than others. But there's still lots of room out there, because as the number of people of customers and developers have grown, the phone capacity and all these platforms, like their abilities have also grown. So there's more things to do. Every year at WWDC we learn about like a couple of new types of apps that will now be able to be built that weren't able to be built last year or until that fall. Like, so there's always new markets opening up. Additionally, players in the old markets just, crumble out, fizzle out, die, get bought, get ruined. So even something that seems like it's locked up for a while, as long as there's no like weird effects like network effect lock-in kind of stuff like social networks and auction sites have, there's almost always room for new entrants. And you don't have to be the dominant player to succeed. You can succeed with only a very small fraction of the market. I consider Overcast incredibly successful. It has something like 2% of the global podcast market. That's literally that's my market share. And it's incredibly successful for me, for my life, and so you don't need to defeat a whole bunch of incumbents with, your one person. Like that's not the requirement here. You just need to find a market for yourself. And there's always going to be that. And even though the market's super crowded and certain categories are hard, there's always churn, there's always new markets opening up, and there's always more people who might want what you are offering.
I want to thank you guys for taking the time to do this, to chat with us. I think it's been a really great conversation about the beginning of the App Store, the business of making apps as indie developers. And I'm sure we can do this again in 10 years and Dave will probably have 1,000 apps by then. So thanks again. This has been really, really great.
Maybe I'll have 3% market share by then.
Right. Thanks. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsor, OmniFocus, for making this special event possible. And thanks to David Smith and Marco Arment. We'll be back tomorrow with another interview, so please join us. And I'll talk to you again in 24 hours, Federico.
I feel like I'm talking to you too much. But no, I'm kidding. This is awesome. So yes, I will talk to you soon, John.